One of the most popular topics brought up by the talking heads in sports media has always been who is the greatest of all time in each sport. LeBron versus Jordan has been talked about since I don't really know when. There's somehow still a discussion in football when Tom Brady still exists. Hockey has this one pretty much figured out with Gretzky, but baseball is a bit of an oddity in these types of discussions. There have been so many different eras and changes in the game over its history that have made it much harder to compare players from different times. Things like lowering the mound, juicing the baseballs, or even creating new stadiums add new factors into considering the production of a player, and it becomes extremely hard to compare those who played at different times. So instead of trying to figure out who was the best player, I wanted to see who the most dominant was for their era. And I don't think there would be any better candidates to compare than Babe Ruth and Bobby Bonds. Or his son, he was pretty okay too. They both stood above their competition in ways no one besides them have, but who's more alone at the top? Before getting into the video, I want to say I know Barry Bonds did steroids, but it's not the topic of this video. There are now decades worth of discourse surrounding that part of his career, and I think it is more than fair to have your own opinion on the numbers he put up. I just feel like I would be repeating everything that has already been said about him a million times before, and it would become redundant. So while I will bring it up a few times later in the video, I won't be mentioning it every time I discuss every single aspect of his career. If you enjoy the video, it'd mean a lot if you subscribed, as we're just 300 people away from 1,000. But let's finally get into the video. Before the age of the Japanese Babe Ruth, there's just Babe Ruth. Some guy who ate hot dogs, worked out like this every day, and then proceeded to walk on the field and throw shutouts or hit 500-foot bombs on a daily basis. He was
the Sultan of SWAT,
the King of Crash,
the Colossus of Clout,
the Colossus of Clout,
the Great Bambino.
He cursed a team for almost 100 years. He set more records than you can count on both the mound and in the batter's box, and led the Red Sox and Yankees to a total of 7 championships. It's easy to get lost in the mythology surrounding the greats from his time, rightfully so, but just how dominant was he when compared to the talent around him? The simple answer is very, but when looking at the reality of his stats, it becomes even more unbelievable just how far above his competition he was. Ruth entered the league during the dead ball era, when offense across the league was at an all-time low, and proceeded to beat the ball so hard he brought the sport out of the dark ages. Before Ruth, the single-season home run record was 27 by Roger Connor, which stood for 35 years before Babe would break it 4 times in his career, starting with 29 in 1919, 54 in 1920, 59 in 1921, and finally his record that stood for 34 years was 60 in 1927. While 29 home runs is now more or less the average season for a lot of players, at the time Ruth accounted for 6% of all home runs in the league, and in 1921 he matched the average number of home runs hit by a team with 59. Babe Ruth was performing on a level that no one else was on and would lead the league in WAR every year from 1919 to 1931, with the exception in 1922 where he still led the league in OPS plus, and 1925 when he was reported dead by a newspaper after becoming extremely sick and hospitalized. The exact reason for his hospital stay has never been confirmed, but Ruth reported stomach pains for months leading up to him fainting on a train, which would cause him to miss the first 2 months of the season and more than likely affected him for the games that he did play. It was the bellyache heard round the world. There's a great article that I'll link below which goes over his hospital stay, and it also gives one of the reasons why the players of his time were talked about as legends. Many reporters at the time hardly ever spoke to the players. They simply wrote the stories as good versus evil fairy tales, with each player who came out on top as a hero. It was the age of muckraking journalism, and more respected reporters didn't have the time to cover a ball game when fingers were falling into meat processors. Ruth was much more than just a home run hitter though. He would get on base more times than he didn't in 5 years, hit .342 for his career, and led the league in total bases 6 times. He was a complete hitter, and his upward swing at the ball changed the thinking at the time that a swing chopping down at the ball was much more effective. While it was either perfect timing or the events are related, in 1921 the owners decided to ban alterations to the baseball, which outlawed spitballs and other trick pitches, while Ruth was changing the approach at the plate. These 2 changes caused batting averages to jump 35 points and produce 3,000 more runs in the 1920s than the 1910s. This offensive boom helped the sport grow and was one of the many steps on the way to the modern era. Babe Ruth would lead arguably the most dominant lineup ever when in the late 1920s the Yankees put together Murderers Row, a lineup that featured 4 Hall of Famers in the first 6 spots of the lineup. Their most dominant year came in 1927 when they went 110-44 and swept the Pittsburgh Pirates to become world champions. The rotation was no slouch either, as they had 2 Hall of Famers in Waite Hoyt and Herb Pennock at the top of the rotation, who would combine for 466 innings of 2.8 ERA ball that season. They outscored their opponents by 376 runs and are still seen by many as the greatest team ever assembled. Babe is the figure that brought the Yankees to the historical powerhouse that they've been throughout the history of the game, but he was already a 3-time world champion before ever sporting the pinstripes. He would make it to the World Series 10 times in his career and would win it all with the Red Sox in 1915, 1916, and 1918 before being traded to the Yankees and coming out on top again in 1923, 1927, 1928, and 1932. While Babe Ruth may be the best hitter of his time, it would be impossible to talk about his career without mentioning what he accomplished before he even started swinging full time. There's a reason every time Shohei is brought up that the only person they can compare him to is Babe Ruth. He was an accomplished pitcher, and many have said that he would have been a Hall of Famer even if he remained on the mound instead of in the batter's box. He posted a 2.28 ERA for his career, and while he did start in the dead ball era with a low offensive environment, he was still exceptional for that time period. He would post a 1.22 ERA plus for his career, which just means his ERA was 22% better than the average pitcher when taking into account the time period and ballparks he played in, and his best pitching season came in 1916 when he had a 1.75 ERA, a 1.58 ERA plus, and didn't surrender a home run in 323 2/3 innings. He could have possibly won a Cy Young if Cy Young hadn't only retired just 5 years prior. He even performed his best when it mattered the most too, as he would throw 29 scoreless innings in the World Series, which would stand as a record for 42 years. His best World Series performance came in Game 1 against the Cubs in the 1918 Fall Classic, when he would throw a complete game shutout. He won all 3 of his World Series starts, throwing a 14-inning complete game, and had a .87 ERA in 31 innings. Ruth would lead the league in home runs 12 times, walks 11 times, OPS 12 times, runs 8 times, RBIs 5 times, and slugging 13 times. Surprisingly, he only led the league in batting average once, despite hitting above .340 10 times. He leads all-time in slugging, OPS, and OPS plus with .690, 1.164, and .206. At the time of his retirement, he had more than double the amount of home runs anyone not named Lou Gehrig had, and would stand as the all-time leader for almost 40 years before the great Hank Aaron surpassed him. His most dominant stretch came from 1919, his first season as a full-time hitter, till 1931, but you could even make the argument including 1918, as he split time as a position player and pitcher, and in 1932, where he still had a 201 OPS plus in 133 games. Ruth was a character larger than life who indulged in gluttonous food habits, would be known to frequent brothels, drink moonshine during Prohibition, and would still perform better than anyone else around him. He had a rock star lifestyle almost a half century before they even existed, and set the foundation for the most dominant franchise in sports history, unfortunately. Somehow, Babe only received 95.13% of the votes in the inaugural 1936 Hall of Fame voting, but it's nice to know voting has been broken ever since its inception. There are a million more stories to tell about Babe Ruth, but his prime is worthy of the legend built around it. And while Hank Aaron surpassed Ruth for the home run record, who surpassed Henry for the current all-time lead?
And Bonds hits one high! Hits it deep! It is out of here! 7:56! Bonds stands alone!
Since Ruth, we've seen countless greats put up numbers like no one else around them. The Yankees alone have seen greats like Mickey Mantle, Joe DiMaggio, Aaron Judge, Yogi Berra, and Derek Jeter put up all-time numbers, but no one is even comparable when discussing offensive power production other than Barry Bonds. Due to many current fans being alive for his career, sometimes reality is even more shocking than myth. Bonds was the most feared hitter during the time when the offensive environment of baseball was at one of its all-time highs. Sammy Sosa would put up 3 of the top 6 home run seasons ever, and yet would never lead the league in any of those seasons. There was was no one who struck fear into opposing teams like him, and there will never be one again. Barry had all the resources in the world to become a major league talent from an early age, as not only his father was a notable ball player, but his godfather was none other than the great Willie Mays. Many people forget just how good Bobby Bonds was, as he posted a 57.9 WAR and 129 OPS plus for his career, hit 332 home runs, and was even featured in Sports Illustrated's all-time All-Star Baseball board game as an all-time giant. He was a star in his own right, who by being overshadowed by his son goes to show just how ridiculous Barry's career was. Barry and Bobby are the only players ever to have 300 home runs and 400 stolen bases. I don't need to state the greatness of Mays for baseball fans, but for anyone learning about the game, he was one of the greatest players ever, as well as arguably the greatest all-around player ever. It was quite the opposite upbringing from Ruth, who came from a very poor family and grew up playing baseball at a reformatory school. Bonds had phenomenal talent from an early age, as he would hit .467 during his senior year at high school, was named an All-American, and would be drafted by the Giants in the second round of the 1982 draft. In an interview with Ronnell Brooks Moon, he would say he always dreamed of being in the outfield of the Giants with his father and Willie, but he wasn't ready for that level at the time. He would decline the contract offered to him and would improve his draft stock at Arizona State University before being drafted 6th overall by the Pittsburgh Pirates. After hitting .347, .442, and .616 with 45 home runs in college. It is hard to imagine anyone but him going first overall, but the Brewers, Giants, Rangers, Reds, and White Sox all decided to pass on him. Notable names ahead of him include Will Clark to the Giants, Hall of Fame Barry Larkin to the Reds, and father of current big leaguer Bobby Witt Jr., Robert Andrew Witt Sr. This draft class would also see Randy Johnson to the Expos in the second round, and John Smoltz to the Tigers all the way in the 22nd round. It is hard to mention Bonds' success without mentioning his abrasive nature with many teammates, as he was an unpopular player in his college locker room, which is a very possible reason for falling down on draft boards. Once signed to the Pirates, Bonds would only appear in 115 minor league games, jumping from Single-A to Triple-A before becoming a full-time big leaguer in just his second year as a professional ball player. The Pirates had hit on their pick, and it was time for him to make his mark on the league. Similar to Ruth, Bonds was a superstar long before he joined the team we all associate him with today. In just over 1,000 games, Barry Bonds would have 3 Gold Gloves, 3 Silver Sluggers, 2 All-Star appearances, and 2 MVPs, all before even playing for his father's former team. His show of excellence both on the field and in the batter's box made him one of the most dynamic players in the league and would get him top 2 in MVP voting in each of his last 3 seasons with the team. He showed good power that grew throughout his time in Pittsburgh, as he would lead the NL in OPS twice before leading both leagues in OBP, slugging, OPS, and OPS plus with .456, .624, 1080, and .204 in 1992, right in time for free agency. Not only were his hitting numbers great, but he had a great glove in left field and would steal 251 bases in his Pirates tenure, with 52 and 43 in 1990 and 1991 respectively. He was a true 5-tool player who would help the Pirates to 3 straight NLCSs while being eliminated all 3 times, 2 of which to the Braves.
Hey! We got Cy Young winners over here!
The one aspect of his game that came up short was his playoff performance. The numbers he put up in the postseason were well below his standards, and in his last ever play as a Pirate, he would shake off his center fielder, Eddie Van Slyke, signed to move in before coming up late on a throw to home and gave up the series-winning run to push the Braves to the World Series. While he may have left a bad taste in both the Pittsburgh fans' and players' mouths, it is impossible to say he was anything less than great on the field for the team. He would post an above-average bat every year for the Buccos and would show improvement almost every year before reaching his peak in his final year with the team. Skill set wise, this was a completely different player than the one we know now, as he would steal 30 bases in all but one season and had solid defense in the outfield. Barry Bonds would leave the team and pursue free agency. Third time's the charm for the Giants, as they would finally get their hands on Bonds after failing to sign him after drafting him in 1982 and passing up on him in the 1985 draft. It's tough to picture this now, but but the Giants were at risk of leaving San Francisco at the time before they landed their superstar. They would sign him to a 6-year deal worth $43.75 million, making him the highest paid player in baseball history at the time. He would choose the number 24 after his godfather Willie Mays gave the Giants the okay to unretire his number, but ultimately sport his father's number 25 before he would step on the field. After earning a record-breaking contract, he would only get better in his first season with San Fran. He would follow up his MVP departure from Pittsburgh with another MVP campaign, leading the league in home runs with 46, and would have a slash line of .336, .458, and .677 with a .206 OPS+. This would be the second of 10 seasons in which he would lead the league in intentional walks, and would somehow be the only year in his career in which he led the league in total bases. It would also be the fourth of 5 consecutive seasons of winning the Silver Slugger and Gold Glove. His first season was everything that he and the Giants could have hoped for, and would only begin one of the most iconic tenures in baseball history. While the current image of Bonds with the Giants is one of him in his late 30s and early 40s, hitting home runs and walking more than anyone else, his early Giants career was much closer to the Pirates version of himself we saw. He would steal at least 28 bases up until the 1998 season, and would earn Gold Gloves in 5 of his first 6 seasons. He still had the elite all-around skill set that he had with the Pirates for the first contract he signed with his new team. Bonds maintained his absurd production while the overall offensive environment in baseball was on the rise, as league-wide runs per game almost went up an entire run, going from 4.12 in 1992 to 4.92 runs a game in 1994. His lowest OPS through the first 6 years with the Giants would be 1.009, which would lead the NL that year while having a .431 on-base percentage. He would post an OPS plus of 182 over this stretch, and somehow justified the most expensive baseball contract ever paid out at the time. The 1999 season would be the beginning of the Bonds we know today. This is the Bonds that is remembered. The Bonds that hit 73 home runs in a season. The Bonds who would get on base more times than he didn't for 4 straight years. These are the years where Barry Bonds went from an all-time great to the most feared hitter ever. Babe Ruth set the single-season record for walks with 170 in 1923, before Barry Bonds would break it with 177 in 2001, before breaking it again in 2002 with 198, and again in 2004 with a mind-numbing total of 232. To put into perspective how crazy that stat is, there have only been 32 seasons where a player has 232 more hits. A walk doesn't have the same value as a hit, but getting on base 232 times without even counting the hits he had is something that seems impossible. While home runs will always be cooler to talk about and are by far more exciting, getting on base scores runs and wins games. And from 2001 to 2004, he would get on base more times than he didn't every single year, topping out at a number that is impossible to replicate even in a video game, with an OBP of 609. This will never happen again. It's impossible to do. Teams have realized the importance of players simply getting on base and would never allow this to happen to someone they're facing. You would have to add up all the most recent intentional walk leaders in the NL, going back to 2017 with Joey Votto to equal Bonds' single-season record in 2004. Barry Bonds was so scary he threw all logic out the window and made teams just give up against him. Giants fans got so fed up with seeing their star player get a free pass to first that they started waving rubber chickens anytime he was not contested at the plate. While his ability to get on base may be the more valuable aspect of his play, he would have never gotten the free pass 688 times in his career if he didn't have the threat to go yard every single time he stepped up to bat. Bonds only led the league in home runs twice, but one of which would set the all-time record of 73, while Sammy Sosa had the most intentional walks that season. In his 4 years of being in another league than his competition, his lowest OPS plus would be 231, which may I remind you means in his worst year over this stretch, he was 131% better than the average player. While his home run record season is the most discussed, it may have only been his second or third most valuable season, as getting on base 58% of the time in 2002 and 61% of the time in 2004 approached the limit of what is possible on the baseball field. He would finish his career with 8 seasons of 40-plus home runs, but the only season above 50 went for the all-time record. A common critique of Bonds is that he never won the big one. He was a great regular season player, but he never delivered when it mattered most. This is very true for the first 15 years of his career, as he would only make the playoffs 5 years in this span, and would only post an OPS above 800 once, and would not win a single series. But when looking at his final 2 postseason appearances in 2002 and 2003, you see a completely different stat line. He would post one of, if not the most impressive World Series stat lines ever in 2002 against the Angels, as he would hit .471, have an OBP of 700, and a slugging of 1.294. There was nothing more he could do to try and will his team to a win, but yet they fell to the Angels in 7 games. Barry would only advance past the first stage once in his entire career, and while his stats were never great outside of his final 2 attempts, I think it is fair in noting that only having 5 appearances in 15 years and never winning a single series makes it pretty hard to put up great numbers. He would face the Braves twice with the Pirates, and while they didn't have Greg Maddux yet, they still had Tom Glavine and John Smoltz, who would make it incredibly hard to advance. Bonds would post a combined 5 for 25 against the 2 Hall of Famers in the playoffs, but would have a regular season OPS above 1,000 against both of them in 194 combined plate appearances. It is a fair critique, but it must be put into context of his team only making it to the playoffs 5 years, and in those appearances only scoring 5 or more runs 5 times in his first 15 years. While he was on the offense and could contribute more to this, I think having a larger sample size would bring his numbers closer to his regular season averages. Bonds and Babe are 2 of the most dangerous hitters in history, but I think their profiles extend past the stats they put on the page. Babe Ruth is the single most recognizable baseball figure ever, someone who has helped bring the game into the modern era. He did things on the field that no one had done before, and there is really one person since that you can even compare him to. Bonds is the most imposing batter ever. Even without swinging the bat, he would do things that no one else has ever done in the batter's box. When arguing who was greater, it's impossible. Each of them played in 2 wildly different eras, with greater improvements in technology, integration, and overall rise in skill. You cannot just compare them 1 to 1. With the increase in skill, it becomes much harder to separate yourself from the pack, as each year the entire league seeks to achieve peak performance out of every single person on their roster. When looking at consecutive years of dominance, Babe Ruth put together a decade of being the best player in the league, but there is no one who ever had or ever will put on the 4-year stretch Barry Bonds did from 2001 to 2004. Ruth transformed the game from playing small ball to hitting it over the fence 50 times a year, while Bonds put together possibly the best seasons humanly possible. As time goes on, it'll only become harder for a player to separate themselves from the competition around them, so unless they do something impossible like pitch and hit at the same time, I don't see it happening again. Babe had the longer run, but Bonds had the higher peak, and for that reason, I believe it's up to what you value more. It's so close, let's just give it to the left-handed hitter with the most total bases, which would be some Polish guy. In all seriousness, thank you very much if you made it to the end of the video. It means a lot that you watch, and we hope we can keep making more for you guys in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll be back next time.